The wind howled through the mountain pass like a wounded animal, carrying with it the promise of another harsh winter. Jacob Morrison pulled his thick coat tighter around his shoulders as he stepped onto the wooden porch of his remote cabin. The structure groaned under the weight of accumulated snow, its logs darkened by years of weathering and isolation. He had built this place with his own hands 5 years ago, choosing the secluded location deliberately. After losing everything in the war and watching his family farm get swallowed by debt, Jacob wanted nothing more than solitude. The nearest town, Copper Falls, sat a full day's ride through treacherous mountain trails. Most folks avoided the journey unless absolutely necessary, but today was different. Today, someone was coming to his cabin. Jacob's weathered hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the letter for the 100th time. The paper had grown soft from repeated handling. The ink slightly faded but still legible. He had placed an advertisement in the Denver newspaper 3 months ago, during a moment of desperate loneliness that had surprised even himself. The long winter nights had become unbearable, filled only with the sound of crackling fire and his own thoughts, seeking companionship for remote mountain living. Honest work, simple life, correspondence welcome. The words had seemed so formal when he wrote them, but they had drawn several responses. Most had stopped writing after learning about the cabin's isolation and the harsh conditions. All except one. Margaret O'Sullivan had written consistently for 2 months. Her letters painted a picture of a woman seeking escape from city life, someone willing to embrace the challenges of frontier living. She claimed to be 26 years old, experienced in household management, and unafraid of hard work. More importantly, her words carried a warmth that had gradually melted some of the ice around Jacob's heart. But as he stood on his porch watching the trail that wound up from the valley, doubt crept in like the cold mountain air. What did he really know about this woman? What if she took one look at his rough appearance and crude living conditions and demanded to be taken back to town immediately? Jacob caught his reflection in the cabin's single window. His beard had grown long and unkempt over the winter. His clothes were patched and worn, and his hands bore the permanent stains of honest labor. He was 32 years old, but felt much older. The war had aged him, and the years of solitude had not been kind. The sound of approaching horses broke through his thoughts. Jacob's heart began to race as he spotted movement on the distant trail. A small wagon emerged from between the pine trees, driven by Tom Fletcher, the mail carrier who made monthly trips to the isolated cabins scattered throughout the mountains. As the wagon drew closer, Jacob could make out a second figure sitting beside Tom. The woman wore a dark blue dress and a heavy woolen cloak, her auburn hair visible beneath a simple bonnet. Even from a distance, she sat with a straight back and confident posture that surprised Jacob. He had expected someone more timid, perhaps even frightened by the journey. The wagon pulled to a stop in front of the cabin, and Tom Fletcher tipped his hat. "Afternoon, Jacob. Got a delivery for you." Tom's weathered face crinkled with amusement. He was one of the few people who knew about Jacob's correspondence, having carried the letters back and forth for months. The woman turned toward Jacob, and their eyes met for the first time. Margaret O'Sullivan was not beautiful in the conventional sense that city folk might admire, but she possessed something that immediately commanded attention. Her green eyes held intelligence and determination, and when she smiled, it transformed her entire face. "Mr. Morrison, I presume?" Her voice carried a slight Irish accent, musical and warm despite the cold air. Jacob found himself momentarily speechless. He had rehearsed this moment countless times, but actually facing this brave woman, who had traveled hundreds of miles to meet him, left him tongue-tied. "Yes, ma'am. Miss O'Sullivan, welcome to," he gestured vaguely at his humble surroundings. "Well, welcome." Margaret stepped down from the wagon with practiced ease, gathering her skirts to avoid the snow. She surveyed the cabin and the surrounding wilderness with keen eyes, taking in every detail. Jacob watched nervously, waiting for signs of disappointment or regret. "It's exactly as you described in your letters," she said finally. "Remote, peaceful, and honest." She turned back to him with that transforming smile. "I like it already." Tom Fletcher unloaded Margaret's belongings, which consisted of a single large trunk and a carpet bag. "I'll be heading back before the weather turns," he announced, Next mail run won't be for another month, so you folks take care of yourselves." As the wagon disappeared back down the trail, Jacob and Margaret stood facing each other in the growing twilight. The silence stretched between them, filled with the whisper of wind through pine branches and the distant call of a mountain hawk. "Your journey must have been difficult," Jacob said, finally finding his voice. "Tom's wagon isn't known for comfort." Margaret laughed, a sound that seemed to warm the very air around them. "I've endured worse. Before coming here, I worked as a housekeeper for a family in Denver. The husband was a gambler and a drunk, and the wife treated the staff like property. I saved every penny for 2 years planning my escape." Jacob felt a surge of respect for this woman who had taken control of her own destiny. "Why did you answer my advertisement?" "There must have been others, men in proper towns, with easier lives to offer. Proper towns hold no appeal for me, Mr. Morrison. I grew up on a farm in Ireland before my family came to America. I know hard work, and I know that true satisfaction comes from building something meaningful with your own hands." She gestured toward the cabin. "This represents freedom to me, freedom from judgment, from pretense, from the expectations of others." As darkness began to fall, Jacob led Margaret toward the cabin. The interior was sparse but clean, dominated by a large stone fireplace, and furnished with pieces he had crafted himself. A rough wooden table sat beneath the single window, surrounded by 2 mismatched chairs. The kitchen consisted of a simple stove, some shelving, and basic supplies. "It's not much," Jacob said, suddenly aware of how primitive his home must appear to someone accustomed to city conveniences. Margaret removed her cloak and bonnet, revealing hair that caught the firelight like burnished copper. She moved through the space with purpose, examining the construction of the furniture, testing the stability of the chairs, running her fingers along the smooth surface of the table. "You built all of this yourself?" she asked. Jacob nodded. "Had to. Nearest carpenter is in Copper Falls, and he charges more than most folks can afford. The workmanship is excellent. You have skilled hands, Mr. Morrison." The compliment caught Jacob off guard. He had become so accustomed to criticism and failure that genuine praise felt foreign. "Thank you. I learned from my father before the war." Margaret busied herself unpacking her carpet bag, producing items that spoke of careful planning. She had brought her own bedding, extra clothing suitable for mountain weather, and various household supplies that Jacob's bachelor existence had long done without. "I'll sleep by the fire tonight," Jacob said awkwardly. "You should take the bedroom. Tomorrow I can start building a proper partition, give you more privacy." "That's very considerate, but unnecessary. We're both adults, Mr. Morrison." And this arrangement was made with mutual understanding of the circumstances. Margaret's directness surprised and relieved him. "However, I do appreciate your thoughtfulness." As they prepared a simple dinner together, Jacob found himself studying this remarkable woman who had appeared in his isolated world. Margaret moved with efficient grace, improving their meal with small touches that transformed basic ingredients into something approaching comfort food. She asked questions about the land, the seasons, the challenges of mountain living, but never complained about what was lacking. "The nearest neighbors are the Hendersons, about 5 miles south," Jacob explained as they ate. "Good folks, but we might not see them until spring. Winter up here can be—" "I counted on that," Margaret replied. "Part of the appeal, actually. I've spent too many years surrounded by people who had nothing meaningful to say. I'd rather have conversations with someone worth talking to, even if it means months between visits with others." That night, as Jacob lay on his makeshift bed near the fireplace, he listened to Margaret settling into the bedroom. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel empty. The presence of another person, someone who had chosen to be there, someone who seemed to understand what he was trying to build in this remote place, filled him with a cautious hope. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and snow began to fall heavily. Winter was closing in with its usual merciless grip, but for the first time, Jacob didn't dread the long months of isolation ahead. Margaret O'Sullivan had brought more than companionship to his cabin. She had brought the possibility of something he had thought lost forever. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they began to navigate this unusual arrangement. But tonight, the remote cabin no longer shivered alone in the cold. The storm that began Margaret's first night in the cabin lasted 3 days. Snow piled against the windows and blocked the door, trapping them inside the small space together. Jacob had worried that such close quarters might create tension or regret. But instead, he found Margaret to be the ideal companion for weathering the isolation. She had immediately taken charge of reorganizing the cabin's limited supplies, creating systems that maximized their efficiency. Margaret turned the cramped space into something approaching a real home, hanging her extra blankets to provide more insulation, and rearranging furniture to create separate areas for different activities. "You've been living like you're camping rather than residing," she observed on the second morning, as she prepared breakfast with ingredients Jacob hadn't even known he possessed. A home should nurture the people in it, not just shelter them from weather. Jacob watched her work, fascinated by her ability to transform mundane tasks into something purposeful. When Margaret cooked, it wasn't just about feeding hunger. She created meals that satisfied both body and spirit. When she mended his worn clothes, her careful stitches didn't just repair fabric, but restored dignity to garments he had nearly discarded. "Where did you learn to do all this?" he asked, observing her repair a damaged chair leg with surprising skill. "Necessity," Margaret replied, testing the stability of her work. "My family lost our farm when I was 16. Mother died the following winter, and father." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Father found comfort in drink rather than solutions. I became responsible for keeping us alive." Jacob understood that kind of burden. The war had forced him to grow up quickly too, making decisions that no young man should have to face. "I'm sorry. That must have been difficult." "It was educational," Margaret said firmly. "I learned that survival requires both practical skills and mental strength. I also learned that depending solely on yourself is sometimes the only reliable option." On the third day, as the storm finally began to clear, they heard an unexpected sound outside. Heavy footsteps crunched through the deep snow, accompanied by men's voices. Jacob immediately reached for his rifle, his body tensing with alarm. "Stay back from the windows," he whispered to Margaret, peering carefully through a gap in the shutters. 3 men stood in his yard, all armed and looking around with the calculating gaze of people evaluating valuable property. Jacob recognized one of them, Cal Brennan, a man with a reputation for taking what he wanted regardless of legal ownership. The other 2 were strangers, but their bearing suggested they were comfortable with violence. "Morrison," Cal shouted toward the cabin, "we know you're in there. Come out, so we can have a civilized conversation." Jacob's mind raced. Cal had been sniffing around his property for over a year, claiming that Jacob's land contained mineral deposits that made it more valuable than anyone realized. Jacob had repeatedly told him the property wasn't for sale, but men like Cal rarely accepted rejection gracefully. "What do they want?" Margaret asked quietly, moving to stand beside Jacob despite his instruction to stay back. "My land. Cal Brennan thinks there might be silver or copper in these mountains. He's made several offers, each one more threatening than the last." Margaret studied the men through the window with calm assessment. "How many times have they come before?" "This is the 3rd visit, but they've never brought additional men, and they've never come during a storm when travel would be nearly impossible." Jacob's jaw tightened. "They're getting desperate." "Morrison," Cal called again. "We're not leaving until we talk. Make this easy on yourself." "What do you want, Brennan?" Jacob shouted back, keeping his rifle ready but out of sight. "Just a friendly discussion about that sale we've been negotiating. I've got new partners now, men with deep pockets and big plans. We're prepared to make you an offer you can't refuse." The threat in those words was unmistakable. Jacob felt Margaret's hand briefly touch his shoulder, a gesture of support that somehow steadied his nerves. "I've told you before, the land isn't for sale at any price," Jacob replied. Cal laughed, but the sound held no humor. "See? That's where you're wrong. Everything has a price, Morrison. Sometimes that price is money. Sometimes it's something else entirely." One of Cal's companions spoke up, his voice carrying easily across the snow. We know you're not alone in there anymore, Morrison. Saw the mail carrier bring someone up the mountain. Wouldn't want any complications to arise from our business discussion. Margaret's eyes flashed with anger, and Jacob saw her jaw clench. The threat against her had clearly struck a nerve, but instead of fear, he saw determination building in her expression. They're trying to intimidate us, she whispered. But they're also revealing weakness. If they were truly confident in their position, they wouldn't need threats. Jacob was struck by her tactical thinking. Margaret wasn't just remaining calm under pressure. She was analyzing the situation like someone accustomed to conflict. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking that bullies often retreat when faced with unexpected resistance. How well do you know the terrain around your cabin?" Jacob nodded slowly. "Better than anyone. I've hunted and trapped every square mile within a day's travel." "Good, because I suspect we're going to need that knowledge." Cal's patience was clearly wearing thin. "You've got 5 minutes to come out, Morrison. After that, we're coming in to collect what we're owed." "You're owed nothing," Jacob shouted back. "This is my legal property, bought and paid for. You have no claim here." "Legal don't always mean much this far from town," one of the other men called out. "Accidents happen in the mountains all the time. Folks disappear. Cabins burn down. Shame when that happens." Margaret moved to the back of the cabin, examining the small rear window that Jacob used for ventilation. It was narrow, but a determined person might be able to squeeze through. "Can you create a distraction at the front?" she asked quietly. Jacob stared at her. "You're not seriously thinking of going out there?" "I'm thinking that 3 men focused on one target might not notice a second person moving through terrain they don't know." Margaret's eyes held steady determination. "You said yourself that you know every inch of this area. Is there a way to reach high ground behind them?" "There's a ridge about 200 yards up the slope." "But Margaret, these men are dangerous. I won't have you risking yourself for my problems." "Our problems," she corrected firmly. "They threatened both of us. And this is my home now too. Besides," she added with a slight smile, "you might be surprised by what I'm capable of." Something in her tone made Jacob reconsider. Margaret had demonstrated competence in every task she'd undertaken since arriving. Perhaps he was underestimating her capabilities. "The ridge would give a clear view of the entire yard," he admitted. "And there are loose rocks up there that could create a significant distraction if they came tumbling down." "Exactly what I was thinking." Jacob found himself agreeing to a plan that seemed both brilliant and terrifying. Margaret would slip out the rear window and make her way up the slope while he continued to engage Cal and his men in conversation. Once she reached the ridge, she would create enough of a rock slide to confuse and hopefully scatter their unwelcome visitors. "Be careful," Jacob said, as Margaret prepared to squeeze through the narrow window. "These men won't hesitate to hurt you if they catch you." "They won't catch me," Margaret replied with quiet confidence. "And, Mr. Morrison, Jacob, when this is over, I think we should have that conversation about what I'm really capable of. There are things about my past that might surprise you." She disappeared through the window with remarkable grace, leaving Jacob to wonder what other secrets this extraordinary woman might be carrying. Outside, Cal Brennan was growing impatient, but Jacob knew he had to buy Margaret enough time to reach the ridge. "Brennan," he called out. "You want to discuss terms? Then let's discuss them properly. What exactly are you offering?" As Jacob engaged the men in negotiation he had no intention of honoring, he watched through the shutters for any sign of Margaret's progress up the mountainside. The afternoon sun created shadows among the pine trees that would help conceal her movement, but the deep snow would make climbing difficult. Several tense minutes passed before Jacob heard the first rumble from above. A cascade of rocks and snow came tumbling down the slope behind Cal and his companions, startling their horses and causing the men to spin around in confusion. "What the hell?" one of them shouted. The distraction was exactly what Jacob needed. He threw open the cabin door and stepped onto the porch with his rifle ready. "I think this conversation is over, Brennan. Time for you to leave my property." Cal's eyes darted between Jacob and the settling rockslide, clearly trying to understand what had happened. "This isn't finished, Morrison. We'll be back with more men and better timing. You do that, Jacob replied steadily. But next time, remember that I'm not as alone or as helpless as you seem to think. As the three men mounted their horses and rode away, Jacob felt a surge of admiration for the woman who had just demonstrated that she was far more than a simple mail-order bride seeking refuge. Margaret O'Sullivan was someone with skills, courage, and secrets that made her a formidable partner in every sense of the word. When she finally returned to the cabin an hour later, snow-covered and exhilarated, Jacob was waiting with hot coffee and a dozen questions, but the most important realization had already settled in his mind. Whatever challenges the mountain winter might bring, he and Margaret would face them together as equals. The weeks following the confrontation with Cal Brennan brought unexpected peace to the mountain cabin. Snow continued to fall steadily, creating a white barrier between Jacob and Margaret and the outside world. But instead of feeling trapped, Jacob found himself experiencing a contentment he hadn't known was possible. Margaret had settled into mountain life with remarkable ease, proving herself capable of tasks that would challenge experienced frontiersmen. She could split firewood with efficient precision, track small game through fresh snow, and had even improvised repairs to the cabin's roof that held firm against the worst winter storms. But it was during the quiet evenings, when they sat before the fireplace sharing stories and dreams, that Jacob began to truly understand the depth of this woman's character. "You never told me what you were really running from in Denver," Jacob said one night. As they watched the flames dance across the hearthstones, Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her fingers working steadily at a piece of embroidery she had started. "The Irish have a saying, is maith and sialai an amser. Time is a good storyteller. I suppose it's time for the full truth." She set down her needlework and turned to face him directly. "My name really is Margaret O'Sullivan, and I did work as a housekeeper in Denver, but before that, I was part of a group that helped families escape dangerous situations. Abusive husbands, corrupt officials, men like Cal Brennan who thought power gave them the right to take whatever they wanted." Jacob felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "That's how you knew to create that distraction on the ridge. You've done this before. More times than I care to count. I learned to shoot, to move silently, to read dangerous men, and predict their actions. It wasn't a life I chose initially, but it became a life I was good at." Margaret's eyes reflected the firelight, but also something deeper. "Eventually, I realized I was always helping other people find safety while never finding it myself." "Is that why you answered my advertisement? You were looking for safety?" Margaret smiled, but it was different from her usual expression. This smile held layers of meaning that spoke to shared understanding between two people who had survived difficult times. "I was looking for something real, Jacob. A life built on honesty and mutual respect, rather than desperation or necessity. Your letters spoke of someone who understood that true partnership means facing challenges together, rather than one person always protecting the other." Jacob reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. "I haven't been entirely honest either. When I told you I lost everything in the war, I meant more than just property. I lost faith in people, in the idea that anyone could be trusted with the truth about who I really am. And who are you really? Someone who believed that living alone was safer than risking disappointment again. Someone who thought that needing another person was a weakness to be overcome." Jacob's thumb traced across Margaret's knuckles. "You've shown me how wrong I was about both of those things." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Both Jacob and Margaret immediately tensed, moving to the window to peer through the shutters. But instead of Cal Brennan and his threatening companions, they saw Tom Fletcher's familiar wagon approaching through the moonlit snow. "Tom?" Jacob called out as he opened the cabin door. "What brings you up here in the middle of winter? Is everything all right?" Tom Fletcher's weathered face was grim as he climbed down from his wagon. "Got word from town that you folks might be having some trouble. Cal Brennan's been shooting his mouth off about mineral rights and making claims about this property that don't sound legal." "What kind of claims?" Margaret asked, stepping onto the porch beside Jacob. "Says he's found documentation proving that your land purchase was invalid, Jacob. Claims there was a prior claim filed that supersedes your deed." Tom shook his head. "Course, nobody in town has actually seen this documentation. But Cal's got enough people convinced that the territorial judge agreed to review the case. Jacob felt his stomach drop. What does that mean? Means Cal can petition to have you removed from the property pending a legal resolution. Could take months, maybe longer. But in the meantime, you'd have to leave the cabin. Margaret's hand found Jacob's arm, her touch providing strength and resolve. What would it take to prove that Jacob's claim is legitimate? Tom scratched his beard thoughtfully. Well, if someone could get to the territorial capital and present Jacob's documentation to the right officials, along with testimony about Cal's harassment, that might settle things quickly, but it's a hard journey in winter, especially for folks not familiar with the route. I'll go, Jacob said immediately. I won't let Brennan steal what I've worked for. No, Margaret said firmly. We'll go. Together. Tom looked surprised. Ma'am, that's a dangerous trip. 2 weeks of travel, through mountain passes that can turn deadly without warning. Even experienced guides sometimes don't make it through. Margaret's expression held the same determination Jacob had seen when she climbed the ridge to scatter Cal's men. Mr. Fletcher, I've made dangerous journeys before, and I suspect that splitting up now would be exactly what Cal Brennan is hoping for. Easier to intimidate one person than two. Jacob realized she was right. Cal had shown himself to be someone who preyed on perceived weakness. Leaving Margaret alone at the cabin would put her in danger, and traveling separately would leave both of them vulnerable. All right, Jacob said. We go together. Tom, can you guide us? Tom nodded slowly. I was hoping you'd ask. I know these mountains better than anyone, and I don't much like the idea of Cal Brennan thinking he can bully decent folks off their land. They spent the next day preparing for the journey. Margaret proved her resourcefulness once again, packing supplies with the efficiency of someone who had traveled under difficult conditions before. She included items Jacob might never have thought of. Extra rope, medical supplies, even a small shovel that could serve multiple purposes. As they loaded Tom's reinforced wagon, Jacob found himself marveling at how naturally he and Margaret worked together. They anticipated each other's needs, communicated with minimal words, and shared the workload without needing to negotiate who was responsible for what. You know, Margaret said as they secured their supplies, I never expected that fighting for our land would feel so right. Like, this is exactly what we're supposed to be doing. Jacob understood exactly what she meant. For the first time since the war, he felt like he was fighting for something worthwhile, something that belonged to him not because he had taken it, but because he had earned it. The journey to the territorial capital proved every bit as challenging as Tom had warned. They faced blizzards that forced them to shelter for entire days. Mountain passes where the wagon had to be carefully guided around treacherous ice. And nights so cold that survival depended on huddling together for warmth. But instead of hardship driving them apart, each challenge seemed to strengthen the bond between Jacob and Margaret. When she fell through thin ice crossing a frozen stream, Jacob's quick action pulled her to safety. When he became disoriented during a whiteout, Margaret's steady voice guided him back to the path. When Tom's wagon broke an axle on rocky terrain, all three of them worked together to create a repair that held for the remainder of the journey. The territorial capital of Cheyenne was a bustling town that seemed almost overwhelming after months of mountain isolation. But Margaret navigated the bureaucratic maze of government offices with the same competence she brought to mountain survival. She found the right officials, presented Jacob's case with clear logic and compelling evidence, and even located witnesses who testified to Cal Brennan's pattern of harassment. The territorial judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Jacob's land claim was completely legitimate. Cal Brennan's challenge was without merit, and any further harassment would result in serious legal consequences. As they prepared to return to their mountain home, Jacob realized that the woman beside him had become something more than a companion or even a partner. Margaret had become the other half of himself, the person who made every challenge manageable and every success meaningful. Margaret, he said as they loaded their wagon for the return journey. When we get back to the cabin, I want to ask you something important. She smiled, that transforming expression that had captured his attention from the very first day. I already know what you're going to ask, Jacob Morrison. And my answer is yes. You haven't heard the question yet. I don't need to. Whatever you're planning to ask, if it means we continue building this life together, facing whatever comes next as equals and partners, then my answer is yes. The return journey passed in a blur of shared laughter, whispered conversations, and plans for improving their remote homestead. When their cabin finally came into view, nestled among the snow-covered pines like something from a fairy tale, Jacob felt a surge of pure happiness. This was home. Not just the building he had constructed with his own hands, but the life he and Margaret were creating together. A life built on mutual respect, shared challenges, and the kind of love that could withstand mountain winters and human threats alike. That night, as they sat before their fireplace once again, Margaret leaned against Jacob's shoulder and spoke the words that had been in both their hearts since that first snowy evening. "Clutch me with purpose, Jacob Morrison. Not because the cabin is cold, but because together we can face whatever storms come our way." As Jacob's arms encircled the remarkable woman who had transformed his isolated existence into a true home, he understood that some risks were worth taking, some partnerships were worth fighting for, and sometimes, the most unexpected journeys led to the most extraordinary destinations. Outside, the mountain wind continued to blow, but inside their remote cabin, two hearts had found their permanent shelter in each other.